Charizard EX is already shaping up to be the best deck of the new post-rotation format. Temporal Forces gives the deck several powerful new options to make use of, and Path to the Peak, a card that was previously very difficult for Charizard to deal with, will be leaving in the 2024 rotation. But for today, I'll be breaking down my current deck list for the Bibarel version of the deck, which has been seeing a huge increase of success over in Japan lately. And if you want to stay up to date with all of my post-rotation deck lists, every week I'm posting early and sometimes exclusive deck lists over on Patreon too. I'll put a link in the description if you want to learn how to get some bonus content and help support the channel in the process. But with that being said, be sure to smack that like button to feed the YouTube algorithm, and let's break down my current post-rotation deck list for Charizard EX. Much like with pre-rotation Charizard lists, we are still playing a split of the different Charmanders, and here you can see we have 2 copies of the Heat Tackle one. That 30 damage from Heat Tackle just sets up so many different KOs for you on future turns. And since we no longer have to worry about Path shutting off our abilities, we're not going to be quite as reliant on the Charmander from 151 to be able to bump those stadiums in the early game. But that being said, I am still choosing to play 2 copies of this guy as well. There definitely are times where you still might want to bump a stadium card with this, but really the main reason we're playing this card still is just because Sableye is still a card that exists. That being said though, the format is still pretty early at the time of recording, so depending on how Lost Zone decks start to fit into this new metagame, we might even be able to just cut these and play more of the 60 HP Charmanders. We are playing 1 copy of Charmeleon. Since we no longer have access to Level Ball, you could play the 100 HP Charmeleon, but I think I still like this one from Paldean Fates just because it has that ability that prevents effects of attacks done to it, meaning that Sableye can't place damage counters on it, and things like TM Devo aren't going to be able to phase this thing. But of course from there, 3 copies of Charizard EX, our main attacker of the deck. This card is still insane even after rotation, being able to accelerate our fire energy whenever we evolve into it, and of course that damage from this attack ramping up over the course of a game. But as mentioned before, we are foregoing the Pidgeot EX evolution line and instead using Bibarel as our engine for this deck. Industrious Incisors doesn't get you exactly what you want, but it certainly Iono-proofs you a little bit better in the late game. And the thing I just like most about this is that it takes away those lower HP multi-prize KOs that you can easily give your opponent sometimes. We basically want to force our opponent to have to either take a single prize or at the minimum 2-shot our Charizard EX. Next up, we have a copy of Skwovet, and for me, this kind of fills the deck space that was previously taken up by the Celebrations Mew. We kind of have an extra bench space to play with now, so we're going to use that for the Skwovet, which allows us to put our hand at the bottom of our deck and draw a single card, which doesn't sound great, but if you have a big clunky hand that you just can't play down, Skwovet allows you to get around that and still be able to draw cards with your Bibarel. We have a copy of Manaphy just to protect our bench. Even though Rapid Strike Urshifu is rotated, Radiant Greninja is definitely still an ever-present threat in the format, and we've got to make sure our Charmanders don't get picked off before they can evolve. Likewise, I also am still running a copy of Jirachi. This is definitely another one of those cards that could come out of the list depending on how good Lost Zone decks are doing after rotation, but at least from some of the early City League results, some of the Lost Zone decks are still seeing some play. So for the moment, we are going to play the Jirachi just to prevent those damage counter placing attacks like Sableye has done to our bench Pokemon. And our only other attacker that we have is going to be Radiant Charizard. As always, its attack cost gets reduced the later we get into the game, and I did still want to have one other backup attacker for us to use, so in the late game, it's going to be easier to probably get this guy set up than having to set up a fresh stage 2 sometimes, and also does give us a single prize attacker that might help force our opponent into a 7-prize game at some point. But checking out our supporter cards, I think a lot of this is going to be pretty familiar territory. We're playing 4 copies of Arven to be able to grab an item and a Pokemon tool card. Even though we're not seeing a ton of cards with Arven, because we have the Bibarel, we can still supplement our draw power a little bit. But Arven is just so good, it just helps us find those rare candies when we need them, get those damage modifiers like Choice Belt, and is going to be the supporter we most often want to see. But next up from there, 3 copies of Iono just to force both players to put their hand at the bottom of their deck and draw cards for each prize they have remaining. Even if we put both players down to, let's say, a 2-card hand, we still have our Bibarel here, which can help us draw back into a more manageable hand size. And from there, 3 copies of Boss's Orders just to be able to choose what we want to take KOs on. Getting into our stadiums, we have 1 copy of Artisan just to be able to find our basic Pokemon. And we also have a copy of Collapsed Stadium just to force both players down to 4 bench Pokemon. Collapsed especially is really good in things like mirror matches, where we can use it to discard our previously damaged Charizards to prevent our opponents from taking KOs. And as you can see, this stadium count is a little bit lower than what we saw pre-rotation, but again, with Path no longer being something that we need to have a response to, we can get away with this lower stadium count now. We have 4 copies of Rare Candy just to be able to skip that middle evolution and go straight into our Charizard EXs. 4 copies of Ultra Ball just to be able to find any Pokemon that we want. We don't mind having to get rid of the 2 cards just because it does still help us play down our hand to a low hand size to be able to refill it with our Bibarels. But easily the card I am most excited about from Temporal Forces that really does help decks like Charizard is the new Buddy Poffin. This is basically our Battle VIP Pass replacement for the new format and allows us to search our deck for 2 basic Pokemon with 70 HP or less and put them onto our bench. The big upside here is that we can play this on any turn of the game, not just the first turn like with Battle VIP Pass, which definitely I think makes more of a case for the whole Bibarel engine since you won't have these extra copies clogging your hand in the mid game. But despite that, we are still playing 3 copies of Nest Ball as well, just to give us more outs to being able to quickly fill our bench in the early game. But also this is our only way to search out Radiant Charizard without having to discard cards like with Ultra Ball. We have a single copy of Pokegear 3.0, which of course lets us look at the top 7 cards of our deck, get a supporter we find there and put it into our hand. Since the Celebrations Mew has now rotated and we aren't playing cards like Lumineon V, I thought it would still be nice to have 1 extra out to finding our supporters. Especially in the early game, we really just want to make sure we can find those early Arvins to make sure we can get set up quickly. Of course, 2 copies of Super Odd to be able to shuffle some energy and Pokemon back into our deck. We have a copy of Lost Vacuum. We're going to be using Arvin a lot with the deck, and unfortunately, we can't search out our stadium cards to be able to bump our opponent's stadiums from time to time. So this gives us an Arvinable, if that's even a word, card we can get to bump those pesky stadiums, or more notably for this format, to get rid of some of those pesky tool cards that we might go up against. So things like the new Maximum Belt, unused for Seal Stones, Bravery Charms, Ancient Booster Energy Capsules, etc. We do still have a copy of Counter Catcher in the deck for whenever we do fall behind on prizes, we can instantly gust up something on our opponent's bench. We can grab this at any point with our Arvin, so if we do fall behind on prizes, we can find this exactly when we might need it. And our final item of the deck is just 1 copy of Switch. Bibarel unfortunately is a much clunkier card than Pidgeot when it comes to moving it out of the active spot, and you do run the risk of your opponent eventually trying to trap Bibarel into the active, so I think at the very minimum you need 1 switching card for this deck. But getting into our tool cards, as you see, we are playing the new Maximum Belt, and I do think this is probably my preferred ace spec right now for Charizard. The 50 damage it gives you against Pokemon EX is just so universally good in so many different matchups. Definitely helps even the playing field against a deck like Chien-Pao, which has always been kind of a sketchier matchup for Charizard. Or even in the mirror match, you now have a way to one-shot their Charizard without them going down to just 1 prize remaining. Likewise, I am still playing a single copy of Choice Belt in the deck. Pokemon V, even though we did lose quite a few of them in the rotation, we still have plenty that are going to be running around, whether it's Giratina V-Star, Arceus V-Star, or even lower HP ones like Entei V, Rotom V, etc. Especially in the case of Radiant Charizard as well, the extra 30 damage means that we're hitting for that perfect 280 to knock out those V-Star Pokemon, again, like Giratina, Arceus, etc. And for our final Pokemon tool card, we have 1 copy of the TM De-Evolution, which gives the Pokemon it's attached to an attack that de-evolves any of your opponent's Pokemon. This is definitely to help us a bit in the mirror match, more so against the Pidgeot version, since they naturally go through more copies of Rare Candy than the Bibarel version. But really this is good against any Charizard deck after we've softened up a couple of their different Charizard EXs. And to round out our deck list today, 8 copies of Basic Fire Energy. So yes, this is a little bit more than what we've seen in the Pidgeot versions of the deck, but we do have to remember Bibarel is a little bit of a liability. We don't want our opponent to try to trap it in the active spot, and playing the extra couple copies of energy just helps prevent those sort of situations from happening. So that's going to be where I'm at currently, at least with Bibzard. Like I mentioned earlier though, I think some things could maybe change depending on what direction the format takes, especially when it comes to the Charmanders and the inclusion of Jirachi. But overall, I think the foundation we have here is really solid. Whether it's this version or the Pidgeot version of the deck, Charizard EX definitely still looks to be a great pick for the new post-rotation format. And I'll be curious to hear from you guys today, which version of the deck do you think you prefer going forward? Are you Team Pidgeot or are you Team Bibarel? Feel free to let me know your thoughts down below in the comment section. But if you guys did enjoy today's content, as always, remember to smack that like button. And if you're feeling maybe a little extra generous, you can always become a patron at patreon.com/rarecandytcg or pick up some merch at rarecandytcg.com. But as always, thanks so much for watching, and I'll see you next time.